Great. Thank you very much, and appreciate your coming this afternoon. We really believe that this is one of the most important things happening right now in the life of our church, and also one of the things we're not taking a vote on here at General Conference, which actually may be a good thing. But the Vital Congregations Initiative really grew out of the connectional table and the call to action report, and really brought together a couple of things. First, it brought together this 10-year commitment that the church is going to have to grow more vital congregations and to sustain those vital congregations. We have to keep in mind that vital congregations are exactly what we want in the United Methodist Church today. We want congregations that are involving more of their people in ministry and mission. We want congregations over time that are growing. We want congregations that are generous with their giving and gifts to mission, and we want congregations that are making more disciples. And that's what vital congregations are all about. A couple of pieces that came together was, first, there was a hope that we could align as many of our conferences within the connection around particular goals. And the other night, we celebrated the goals that came forth from those conferences. 72 conferences put forth goals for our future. We recognize that as we work on those goals together, that we're going to see more and more vital congregations within our denomination. And so that was a very positive step. Again, it wasn't an action of General Conference. This was a commitment by people at the grassroots level. 27,000 of our United Methodist congregations all around the world setting goals for the future of their congregation, but more importantly, the future of our whole church. One of the interesting things is when you put all those goals together and to see that those 27,000 congregations and conferences working with them are gonna raise and give $3.6 billion to mission. I mean, think about that, $3.6 billion to mission. And that'll be over a 4-year period of time. And so that's, you know, what the strength is by collaborating, working together, being in partnership with each other. Now, what's really important is the path forward, because setting a goal is one thing, but then how do we move forward? And one of the things that a number of people have been asking is, how will the restructure impact vital congregations? And this has been an important conversation for us and a very important question. One of the things that really happened along the way as it related to restructure was it zeroed in on some of the important aspects, but it left the vital congregations piece out of the conversation. And so we began to talk about how do we streamline, how do we save money, all very important things within the life of the denomination, but we weren't talking about what's the structure that's going to help us to grow more vital congregations. And that's clearly what got lost in the conversation. And so going forward, it's really going to be the leaders of the church, the bishops, annual conference leadership, general secretaries, that will really need to work together to reinvigorate the structure with how are we going to grow and sustain more vital congregations in the United Methodist Church. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues and let them also say a couple of comments, and then we'll take your questions. So we'll begin with Bishop Hopkins, the chair of Connectional Table, where much of this grew out of, and then Reverend Amy Valdez Barker, who is the project manager for vital congregations.
I'm just excited that we're talking about vital congregations, because a lot gets lost when we're talking about restructure. From the beginning, when the Council of Bishops and the Connectional Table started working on this at the beginning of the quadrennium, they said, where are we being gifted? And they actually took a look around their annual conferences, and all across the world, United Methodist bishops were seeing incredible ministry that wasn't necessarily getting heard. These are people who are doing innovation to reach people in their mission field. And even some places they're reaching younger people, more diverse people. And it's a mixed bag. But when you focus on what God is giving us at the local level, we said, how can we bring that up? And so there was a conversation started between the Council of Bishops and the Connectional Table, as we're structured, that's required, to say, how do we move forward? And so they initiated the 2 studies you're aware of, the Towers-Watson study to look on what about vital congregations in this country. They intentionally said we don't have enough funding at this point or time to do it in central conferences, but in their original report said that this is something that ought to be done in the future. And that actually, I think, is one of the recommendations coming out of this General Conference, that we continue to look at vital congregations in the central conferences. But it was out of that Towers-Watson, and then another report, an APEC study, looked at what are some of the perceptions about how we're structured. And they said that there are large distances between our local people and the people at the annual conference level, and even further at the general church level in terms of perceptions. And so it's really part of the flat world concept, that over time people are networking, using social media, finding resources of other people who are doing it, not necessarily going to a proprietary system of people who are providing services. So we started this long process called the Call to Action, and in that the Council of Bishops and Connectional Table affirmed the adaptive challenge to focus on vital congregations for a minimum of 10 years. Right off the bat, it was criticized as being, well, you're too parochial. You're looking at just creating more churches. But when we put the term adaptive challenge in front of that, that comes from Ron Heifetz, professor at Harvard, that says basically if you knew how to do it, you'd already be doing it. But in adaptive challenges, we do not know what vital congregations are going to look like over the next 10, 20 years that's going to reach younger, more diverse people. If we knew that, we'd be doing it in every annual conference. However, there are some people leading the way, and they tend to be people in the field who are doing innovation. So even as we try to get all of our churches to set goals and report data, it's really a way of trying to learn more about where those bright spots are, so we can connect the dots between those that are doing it and those that say, how can we learn from those groups?
Yeah, and I think the most exciting part about the Vital Congregations work is the stories that continue to emerge. I received the stories that they come into the website, and one of the great stories that came up was, thank you so much for challenging us for these goals. As we started to look at our congregation, this church had said, we realized when we looked at those 5 goals that we were doing really good in a couple of the areas, but as a congregation we weren't doing hardly anything in missions. And we would have never actually stopped and reflected about that until we had this challenge before us. And so their congregation was excited about the possibility that they wanted to focus more on missions, on helping the members of their congregation go out and serve in their communities. And those stories are just beginning to emerge. I mean, that, I think, for me, is one of the most exciting elements of it, is we know that people are doing good things across the denomination, across the world. We have not been able to celebrate those good things enough. And the next challenge is waking churches up to be doing the mission and the ministry of the church. I just did a comparative analysis for the work that I'm doing in my PhD studies on the Vital Congregations research and several other researches. And what I've uncovered is that churches who lose focus on the main thing, making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, are churches that are challenged, more challenged than others. And if we could just get back to focusing on what it means to respond to that challenge, to that invitation of Christ, that commission to go therefore and make disciples of all nations, what does that mean for each congregation in their context and in their community, and how can they respond to that in the most faithful and meaningful way that also produces fruit for God's kingdom in this world? So there's so much excitement of the possibilities when we're all moving in the same direction and keeping the main thing, and that is discipleship. And so I am personally excited about the stories that keep emerging, and I'm excited about inviting everyone across the denomination, every congregation across the denomination, to stay focused on the main thing.
Great. So we'll take some questions. Yes.
Well, we just saw, I'm Heather Hahn with the United Methodist News Service, and my main question...
There's a microphone there.
Hi, I'm Heather Hahn with the United Methodist News Service, and my main question is, we've just seen, as you said, a lot of these restructuring conversations, we've lost sight of this main goal, the main thing of having vital congregations. How do you see what has just gotten sort of tentative approval this morning, helping general agencies to perhaps resource to provide and help form more vital congregations?
Well, I think what was passed today, is still unfolding, and we're going to learn over the next couple of years what this new structure means for us and how we work together. The concern we would have is that it not slow down the progress that's already begun and people working toward their goals and becoming more vital. The hope is, and this is an initiative like the Vital Congregations Project is an initiative that is not claimed by any one agency, and I think that's a real strength. It is also an initiative that's being led through the Council of Bishops, but it's also an initiative that really needs to happen at the local level. And so that's what I was saying earlier, that this really needs to be everybody coming and working together. There's nothing in the budget that will say this is for vital congregations. So this isn't a program, this is a strategy. This is a way for us to work together. This is a way for us to collaborate. And so it really depends on the church leadership coming together and working together in collaborative ways, that we can't operate in our silos. Annual conferences, general agencies, Council of Bishops, we are all going to need to work together for that to happen. In the structure, there is the possibility for more collaborative work in terms of the oversight body, but that's going to take some time for that to develop. So again, much of this is going to happen at the grassroots level. I don't know if Amy or Bishop Hopkins want to add anything to that.
I'd like to add a little bit. The church is more about relationships than it is about structure.
Sure.
And if anything comes out of our decision today, it's because we will reshape the way we start relating to each other in a new way. And that's among the agencies, between the agencies, annual conference leaders. And as bishops of the church that work both with the agencies and annual conferences and local churches, we want to foster those relationships that focus on the essentials of being in ministry together. And so ministry includes both forming people in Christ, having them do mission, and having them do advocacy. And many people come into the church, as you know, because they have an experience that's very personal, and they're trying to relate to God, and then they get to relate to somebody else, and then they usually get into the mission area. Then once they get into the mission area, they see things that are not just, and they want to be advocates. And then once they're advocates, people see them, they say, who are these people anyway that are out there doing this stuff? And they say, I want to, and then a story is told, and then they say, oh, it's about God, and let me hear your story. And they get back into that cycle. Now, we also know that people come into the faith through justice activities, and they come in through mission activities now as much as they do in Christian forming activities. But what we're hoping is that there's a focus of new relationships, of getting people into those, so that the church will grow. The other thing I think, this is kind of confessional, we spent a number of years doing all of the fruits of assuming we had strong congregations, and we left some of that Christian formation behind. And if we're going to have strong mission work and strong advocacy work, we look at and we can say, who's behind us in terms of what generations and how are we forming people? So the emphasis on vital congregations is really trying to build the base, if you will, and respond to the needs of the world at the same time.
Other questions?
Sorry about this. Just I'll ask, what difference do you think making these goals will make? Having these goals set out sort of on the website will make in helping these congregations reach said goals?
Right. I think this is probably a unique, not only a unique opportunity, but a very distinctive occurrence in the General Conference. For once, we didn't look back, but we looked forward and said, what are we going to do in this quadrennium? Much of what we do at General Conference is really looking back and saying and celebrating the great work that's been done. And that's very important, but we also need to look forward. We're in a very challenged time in the life of our denomination, and particularly as that relates to the United States. And I can't underscore this enough, and Bishop Hopkins talked about this as well. If we are going to be relevant, and if we are going to be impactful as it relates to our mission, we need vital congregations. Right now, you know, the work that we do happens all around the world. But as if we continue to diminish in the United States, it's going to mean less resources for the mission work around the world. This is a very key concern that we as leaders have, that we want to have an impactful mission and that we need vital congregations to do that. These are the places where great generosity is happening. These are the places where people are engaged in mission and ministry. But if we're not building up the body of Christ, so two of the goals are about building up the body of Christ. Small groups and maturing disciples, and also worship and praising God. Three of the goals are about moving into the community, new professions of faith, engaging people in the community in mission, and also giving to mission. But those last three will suffer dramatically if we're not doing the whole piece. And so one of the great concerns we have for the future of the church is that if we continue to diminish, we have real challenges. I know in the Baltimore-Washington Conference, you know, I can just put it very bluntly and very specifically. And I'm sure other conferences can do the same thing. Every time we lose a worshiper, we lose $1,000 to $2,000 in contributions. $1,000 to $2,000. Well, that doesn't sound like much until you lose 500, 1,000, 2,000 worshipers. And then you put that all across all of our conferences, and you begin to see that that becomes a very, very significant number in terms of what's happening to our mission. Now, I don't want anybody to leave here and think, oh, vital congregations are all about trying to grow the church so that it has more money. No, that's not it at all. That's just a basic fact and reality of what's happening in our time. Our real commitment and goal is to make new disciples. So that people come into a loving relationship with God through Jesus Christ, and to be ending malaria, and to be serving the poor, and to be building clinics, and all of these types of things. And that's not going to happen unless we continue to strengthen our congregations all around the world. You want to add something? Go ahead.
I'd like to comment just briefly. I thought maybe Amy wanted to say something about the numbers, because she's really our numbers person. I mean, she's done a lot of work on this. But one of the things that we're trying to imagine is that in most of our annual conferences years ago, the agencies made reports, and everybody said, "Wonderful, that's the way the world worked." And then we said, "No, we've got to engage our local congregations." And so most annual conferences shifted so that at annual conference sessions, you do celebrate the agency work and you pull out a few agencies that are featured. The rest of them have written reports. But much of the annual conference is the accountability and the celebration of what's happening out in the field, local churches. I try to imagine what would a general conference look like in 2016 or 2020 if it was really about annual conferences in local churches as well as our general church work. What would we bring? And it was a conversation like that I was having with John. And he said, well, you know, what if we had goals and had people bring it? So in some sense, this bringing of goals was a way of every church that has a conversation about what they're going to do becomes a part of general conference. But we're just starting at that. I'm trying to imagine what would it look like in the future with an annual conference where every annual conference says, we're part of that. We want to be a part of it. We're sending not just our delegates to make legislative decisions. We want to talk about discipling and mission and advocacy we're doing, and find channels to turn what is essentially a legislative assembly into a celebration for our worldwide church.
What, in response to your question, Heather, what the website has done is put sort of the realities out there, right? So now every single United Methodist Church in the United States can know what their trend is and know where they've been in the past 5 years. And it's open and available to anyone. And I think one of the things that it has done is it has also opened the awareness for lay people who never even knew what the process was for turning in statistics and end-of-year reports. So more questions are arising in the information and saying, oh, well, that doesn't seem right. You know, this number doesn't necessarily seem right. or we didn't even realize that we are losing this number of people in worship or in mission or in giving. And so having that information out there has sort of raised awareness across the churches who are looking at the website to find their information. I think it's also a matter of accountability and helping laity and clergy partner together in holding themselves accountable to the goals of where they want to move the church forward in. So when the goals are out there on the website, laity can look and clergy can look and say, you know, in 2013, this is where we said we wanted to go. How are we doing on this? We wanted to have more people professing their faith. We wanted to have more people serving God in mission. We wanted to have more people involved in small groups. So how are we doing on this? And local congregations can have those conversations openly, honestly, and candidly, and hopefully hold one another accountable to moving forward for God's mission in this world. So,
just to bring this point to a close, one of the reasons you set goals is to change your future. And right now, as the United Methodist Church, we think we can be doing better. And so you put out some bold goals and start to move toward those. And that's what churches all across the denomination did.
It's more than numbers, too. I want to thank the staff at General Counsel in Finance and Administration, especially Scott Brewer and his people, because they're the ones that put together a way of aggregating the goals. But they also put together the vital signs so every local congregation can report in. Mm-hmm. And we were told that there were some conferences that nobody had actually promoted this at all, but individual churches found out about it and are entering their data on a weekly basis because it was something that they needed anyway. And but our conference in East Ohio, the person who's championing it for us, Steve Court, he said it's really all about the stories. He said any church of any site can tell stories. Mm-hmm. Well, Scott Brewer at the GCFA, I was with him once when he was looking at his computer list coming in of some of the stories, and he said, you've got to see this one. And it was a story about a baptism that was held in one of our churches, but the father couldn't be there, and I can't remember whether he was in the military, he was working. So they Skyped the father in for the baptism, so that the congregation could see this father and the father could see the congregation and participate in the baptism of this child. Well, I would have never thought if I were a pastor. Now, we don't want fathers not to be there for baptisms, but the concept of learning how other churches are doing creative ministry is probably as important as the numbers. And of course, if you do that once, then it raises the expectation, it changes your future, because one story says, well, if we did it here, then what could we do next? And so it's that creativity, innovation we're looking for, as well as kind of a hard kind of thing. And by the way, all of the numbers were set by the churches themselves. It wasn't imposed. Now, to be honest, in East Ohio, the superintendent said, well, we got about 20% or so of our churches, we don't have numbers. I said, what are we going to do? And the superintendent said, well, we'll just hold up and say, where have they been and what we think the number is. But as soon as August comes and we have one-on-one conversations with our pastors, and as soon as the charge conference comes in the fall, we're going to ask them, are we about right to get them to own them? And if we're wrong, we'll rechange them and put them in there. So we're making progress, not perfection. So those goals are not to be judgmental of pastors or to be used like, well, you're not reaching your, it's your goal. And the question is, what are you working to obtain to move towards those goals? What's worked for you we can celebrate? What have you tried that you failed, and what did you learn from that? Oh, and by the way, how can we help you in the next step?
I think there was a question over here.
Yep. Catherine Whitty from the Nebraska Conference. As I work with churches, they echo one of the goals about spiritual formation and being a lack of some of that and the work that we need to do there. Is there a specific strategy in mind as you approach that targets children and youth in United Methodist Christian education? Because the goals themselves seem like adult goals. And if you think about spiritual formation and where we need to go, we need to have that conversation. I just wondered what the conversation's been.
Sure. Amy?
Towers Watson's information came back and said that in the small groups element, it was programs for children and youth that was part of that collaborative small group area that were essential in those highly vital congregations. And you're talking to a PhD student in Christian education and congregational studies. And for me, the generativity of our congregations is of utmost importance. So what are we doing to actually pass on a faith that is rich, a faith that is rooted in our Wesleyan heritage, and a faith that will sustain the next generations for years to come. And the research that we're finding is that in our young adult and younger populations is that that we have not done that well. And we have not been intentional about faith formation in our children and our youth. And so small groups is just one component of the goal setting, but what is behind it is more of the faith formation and Christian formation. And so we have to have those conversations with leaders in the church. We have to have those conversations with youth and young adults. We need to find strategies, but we can't do it alone, and we can't do it necessarily blanket-wise. We've got to raise awareness in every congregation that of utmost importance is passing on the faith, right? So, in the research, the 16 drivers, yes. Yes, it's a raising of awareness.
Well, I would also go a little further to explain and say that all ministry is contextual. This is not a program. This is about helping people to work together. And one of the things that we see moving into the future is resourcing district superintendents and conference staff with good questions, not a new program. But what are the good questions that you are struggling with, but also what are the questions that you can be in conversation with your pastors and your lay leadership that raise those type of questions? For instance, how are you connecting with children in your community? How is your congregation growing children in the faith? And so not to try and offer them a program, because all ministry really needs to be contextual. If we go in and say, here's the community program to attract children, that's going to work in some communities and not in other communities. It's going to work for some churches that might have gifts in those areas and not for other churches. And each church really has to identify how has God gifted us and how do we work in our community.